The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his crisp uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. He had been serving as a royal guard for 15 years, watching princes and princesses grow up before his eyes. But today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Thomas had always taken pride in his work. Standing tall at 6 feet, with graying hair that spoke of his experience, he commanded respect from younger guards and visitors alike. His job was simple on paper: protect the royal family, maintain security, and follow protocol. In reality, it meant long hours of standing perfectly still, eyes constantly scanning for any sign of trouble, while remaining virtually invisible to the family he protected. Prince George, now 10 years old, had become a familiar sight around the palace grounds. Thomas had watched the young prince take his first wobbly steps in the garden, heard his delighted laughter echoing through the hallways, and observed him grow into a curious, energetic boy who seemed to notice everything around him. Most royal children barely acknowledge the guards, seeing them as part of the furniture rather than real people with families and feelings of their own. On this particular Tuesday morning, Thomas took his usual position near the main entrance. His wife Sarah had been feeling unwell lately, and the medical bills were starting to pile up. She needed surgery that their insurance wouldn't fully cover, and Thomas had been working extra shifts to try to make ends meet. The stress was beginning to show on his weathered face, though he did his best to maintain his professional composure. As the morning progressed, the palace came alive with its usual bustle. Staff members hurried about their duties, visitors came and went for scheduled appointments, and the royal family went about their daily routines. Thomas remained at his post, a silent sentinel watching over it all. Around 10 o'clock, he noticed Prince George walking across the courtyard with his tutor, discussing what appeared to be a history lesson about the palace itself. The young prince was animated, asking questions and pointing at various architectural features. Thomas couldn't help but smile slightly at the boy's enthusiasm for learning about his heritage. What Thomas didn't know was that Prince George had been watching him too. Children have a way of noticing things that adults often miss, and the observant young prince had picked up on subtle changes in the guard's demeanor over the past few weeks. Thomas's usually straight shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight, and there were worry lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Prince George had always been taught to be aware of the people around him, not just as staff or security, but as human beings with their own lives and challenges. His parents, Prince William and Catherine, had made sure their children understood that respect and kindness should extend to everyone, regardless of their position or title. As the prince passed by Thomas's position, their eyes met briefly. Thomas straightened automatically and gave a subtle nod of acknowledgement as protocol dictated. But Prince George did something unexpected. He paused in his conversation with his tutor and gave Thomas a genuine, warm smile. It wasn't the polite, practiced smile that royal children often gave to staff, but something more personal and real. Thomas felt a flutter of surprise. In all his years of service, few members of the royal family had shown him such direct personal recognition. He maintained his professional stance, but something inside him warmed at the simple gesture of human connection. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but Thomas found his thoughts returning to that brief moment. It reminded him of why he had originally been drawn to this job, not just for the steady pay or the prestige, but for the chance to serve something greater than himself. Over the years, the routine had sometimes made him forget the honor and responsibility that came with protecting the future king and his family. Little did Thomas know that this small interaction was just the beginning. Prince George had been thinking too, and the wheels were already turning in the young prince's mind. He had noticed something in the guard's eyes that spoke of worry and burden, and his naturally compassionate nature wouldn't let him simply walk away and forget about it. As lunchtime approached, Thomas allowed himself a brief moment to think about Sarah, hoping she was feeling better today. The doctor's appointment was scheduled for next week, and they would finally know more about the treatment she needed. He pushed the worry aside and focused on his duties, unaware that his quiet dedication and the weight he carried had not gone unnoticed by the very person he was sworn to protect. The following afternoon brought an unexpected change to Thomas's routine. As he stood at his usual post, he noticed Prince George approaching with what appeared to be a drawing pad tucked under his arm. The young prince seemed to be on a mission, his steps purposeful and his expression thoughtful. Prince George had spent the previous evening thinking about the guard he had seen that morning. Something about the man's quiet dignity and the sadness he had glimpsed behind his professional facade had stayed with him. During his evening lessons about leadership and service, his mother had spoken about how true nobility came from caring for others, especially those who served without recognition. Thomas watched as the prince approached, wondering if perhaps he needed directions or if there was a security matter to address. But instead of walking past, Prince George stopped directly in front of him and looked up with those earnest blue eyes that reminded Thomas so much of his own grandson. "Good afternoon, sir," Prince George said politely. "I hope you don't mind, but I was wondering if I could ask you something." Thomas was momentarily taken aback. Protocol dictated that he should remain professional and direct the prince to speak with his private secretary if he had any requests. But there was something so genuine in the boy's manner that Thomas found himself responding naturally. "Of course, Your Highness. How may I help you?" Prince George opened his drawing pad and revealed a detailed sketch of the palace courtyard, complete with the guard posts and the people who occupied them. Thomas was amazed by the artistic skill and attention to detail for someone so young. "I've been drawing the palace and the people who make it work," Prince George explained. "My art teacher says that to draw something properly, you need to really observe it and understand what makes it special. I've noticed that you're here every day, keeping everyone safe, but I realized I don't know anything about you as a person." Thomas felt a lump forming in his throat. In 15 years of service, no one from the royal family had ever expressed such interest in him as an individual. He struggled to find the right words, maintaining his professional composure while being moved by the young prince's thoughtfulness. "That's very kind of you to notice, Your Highness. I'm honored to serve your family." But Prince George wasn't satisfied with the formal response. "That's not what I meant," he said gently. "I know you serve us and you do it very well. But what I want to know is about you. Do you have a family? What makes you happy when you're not working?" Thomas looked around, uncertain about how to respond to such personal questions. Other guards might think he was overstepping boundaries by engaging in conversation with a member of the royal family. But the genuine curiosity and kindness in Prince George's voice made it impossible to give a cold, professional response. "I do have a family, Your Highness," Thomas said quietly. "A wife named Sarah and 2 grown children. They live about an hour from here." Prince George's face lit up with interest. "Tell me about them. What does your wife like to do?" For the next few minutes, Thomas found himself sharing stories about Sarah's love of gardening, how she grew the most beautiful roses in their neighborhood, and how she volunteered at the local animal shelter. He spoke about his daughter, who was training to be a nurse, and his son, who worked as a mechanic. As he talked, he felt some of the stress and worry lift from his shoulders. Prince George listened intently to every word, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in the answers. When Thomas mentioned that Sarah hadn't been feeling well lately, the prince's expression became concerned. "Is she going to be okay?" Prince George asked with the earnest worry that only a child can express. Thomas felt his professional mask slip slightly. "We hope so, Your Highness. She's seeing a doctor soon to find out more." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince George's tutor, reminding him of his next lesson. But before he left, the prince did something that would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. "Thank you for telling me about your family," Prince George said formally, but then his voice softened. "I hope your wife feels better soon. She sounds like a wonderful person." As the prince walked away, Thomas stood in stunned silence. He had just experienced something unprecedented in his career. A member of the royal family had treated him not as a servant or a piece of security equipment, but as a fellow human being worthy of interest and concern. That evening, Thomas went home with a lighter heart than he had carried in weeks. When he told Sarah about his conversation with Prince George, her eyes filled with tears of joy. After years of her husband's invisible service, someone had finally seen him as more than just a uniform. Neither Thomas nor Sarah could have imagined that this simple conversation would set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever. Prince George had planted a seed of kindness that was already beginning to grow in ways no one could have predicted. 3 days had passed since Prince George's conversation with Thomas, but the young prince couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. During his private study time, instead of focusing on his history books, he found himself researching something entirely different: the challenges, faced by families dealing with medical expenses and the support systems available to palace staff. Prince George had always been taught that with privilege came responsibility, and his parents had instilled in him the importance of using his position to help others. But this was the first time he had encountered a situation where someone he knew personally was facing real hardship. The weight of that knowledge sat heavily on his young shoulders. Thomas, meanwhile, had been experiencing something unexpected. Other guards had begun to notice that Prince George would nod to him specifically when passing, sometimes even offering a few words of greeting. Word had spread quietly through the staff that the young prince had shown particular interest in Thomas, and this had elevated Thomas's standing among his colleagues in a way that made him both proud and slightly uncomfortable. On Friday morning, Thomas received news that would change everything. Sarah's doctor had called with the results of her recent tests. The surgery she needed was more complicated than they had initially thought, and the cost would be nearly 3 times what they had saved. Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet as he tried to process how they would possibly manage such an enormous expense. During his lunch break, Thomas sat alone in the staff break room, staring at the medical estimate and feeling overwhelmed. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he calculated and recalculated their finances, trying to find a way to make the numbers work. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice someone entering the room until a gentle voice spoke. "Mr. Mitchell, are you all right?" Thomas looked up to see Prince George standing in the doorway, his young face creased with genuine concern. The prince had been looking for his tutor when he noticed Thomas sitting alone, with what appeared to be important papers spread before him. Thomas quickly gathered the medical documents, embarrassed to be seen in such a vulnerable moment. "Your Highness, I'm sorry. I was just taking care of some personal matters during my break." But Prince George had already seen the worried expression on Thomas's face, and his natural empathy wouldn't let him simply walk away. "Is it about your wife? Is she okay?" The direct question, asked with such sincere concern, broke through Thomas's professional reserve. "She needs surgery, Your Highness, but—" He paused, struggling with how much to share. "But it's quite expensive." Prince George stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. At 10 years old, he didn't fully understand the complexities of medical insurance or financial hardship, but he understood something far more important, that someone who dedicated his life to protecting others was now facing a crisis with no one to protect him. "How much does it cost?" Prince George asked simply. Thomas hesitated. "It's not something you should worry about, Your Highness. These are adult concerns." "But you're worried about it," Prince George pointed out with the straightforward logic that only children possess. "And if someone who takes care of my family is worried, then maybe our family should help take care of you." The simplicity and sincerity of the statement left Thomas speechless. He had spent years maintaining professional distance, never allowing himself to think that the royal family might consider him anything more than an employee. Yet here was this young prince, barely 10 years old, expressing a level of care and responsibility that touched Thomas to his core. Prince George sat down across from Thomas, his expression serious and thoughtful. "My father always tells me that leadership means taking care of the people who take care of you. He says that's what makes someone worthy of being called a prince, not the title, but how you treat others." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he fought to maintain his composure. "Your Highness, your kindness means more to me than you know, but this isn't your responsibility." "Maybe not," Prince George admitted. "But my grandmother always says that when you have the power to help someone and you choose not to, you're not really using your power for good. And I want to use mine for good." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince George's tutor, who had been searching for him. As the prince prepared to leave for his next lesson, he turned back to Thomas one final time. "Mr. Mitchell, can you give me your wife's full name and the name of her doctor? I'd like to do some research for a school project I'm working on about community service." Thomas provided the information, though he couldn't imagine what kind of school project would require such details. As Prince George left the room, Thomas felt a strange mixture of hope and disbelief. He had just witnessed something extraordinary, a young member of the royal family displaying the kind of compassion and sense of duty that spoke to the very best of what leadership could be. That afternoon, Prince George marched into his mother's private office with a determination that surprised Catherine. "Mummy, I need to talk to you about something very important. It's about one of our guards, and I think we need to help him." Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, looked up from her correspondence to see her eldest son standing in her office doorway, with an expression she had rarely seen before. Prince George's usual playful demeanor had been replaced by something much more serious and purposeful. "Come in, darling," Catherine said, setting aside her papers and giving George her full attention. "You look like you have something very important on your mind." Prince George closed the door behind him and walked over to sit in the chair across from his mother's desk. He had spent the past hour thinking carefully about how to present his case, knowing that what he was about to propose was unusual and would require careful explanation. "Mummy, do you remember when you taught me about noblesse oblige?" George began, using the French term his mother had explained to him months earlier. Catherine smiled, impressed that he remembered the lesson about how privilege carried the obligation to help others. "Of course I do." "Why do you ask?" "Because I think this is one of those times when we need to live up to what that means," George said earnestly. "There's a guard here, Mr. Mitchell, who has been protecting our family for 15 years. His wife is very sick and needs surgery, but they can't afford it." Catherine felt a surge of pride at her son's concern for others, but also a touch of surprise at his direct involvement in a staff member's personal affairs. "How did you learn about this situation, George?" Prince George explained about his conversations with Thomas, his growing awareness of the guard's obvious worry, and the moment when he had seen the medical bills during Thomas's lunch break. He spoke with the passionate conviction of a child who had discovered injustice and wanted desperately to fix it. "I know it's not normal for us to get involved in personal matters like this," George continued, "but Daddy always says that exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses. Mr. Mitchell has spent 15 years protecting us, and now he needs protection too." Catherine listened carefully as her son laid out his reasoning. She was struck not only by his compassion, but by the maturity of his thinking. At 10 years old, George was already demonstrating the kind of empathetic leadership that would serve him well in his future role. "What exactly are you proposing we do?" Catherine asked gently. "I think we should help pay for the surgery," George said without hesitation, not as charity, but as recognition for his years of loyal service. "Maybe we could call it a special service award or something like that, so he doesn't feel like we're just giving him money." Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. While the royal family did have discretionary funds for staff emergencies, George's proposal went beyond typical protocol. It was also exactly the kind of compassionate gesture that reflected the values she and William were trying to instill in their children. "Have you thought about how Mr. Mitchell might feel about this?" Catherine asked. "Sometimes people are proud, and accepting help can be difficult for them." Prince George nodded seriously. "I thought about that too. But when I saw him looking at those medical bills, he looked so sad and worried. I don't think pride should stop someone from getting help when they really need it, especially when they've spent their whole career helping other people." That evening, Catherine discussed George's proposal with Prince William over dinner. William listened with growing amazement as his wife recounted their son's passionate plea for Thomas Mitchell. "He's right, you know," William said after hearing the full story. "Mitchell has been exemplary in his service. I remember when George was just learning to walk. Mitchell was always so patient when George would toddle over to examine his uniform buttons. What concerns me," Catherine admitted, "is the precedent this might set. If we start getting personally involved in every staff member's private challenges, but that's not what this is," William pointed out. "This isn't George responding to a general policy question. This is him recognizing a specific situation involving someone who has been part of our lives for years, and wanting to respond with the kind of personal leadership we've been teaching him about." The discussion continued well into the evening, with both parents weighing the practical considerations against the moral imperative their son had identified. Finally, William made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. "I think we should let George take the lead on this," he announced. "Not financially, of course, but in terms of how it's presented and handled. This is his initiative, born from his own observation and conscience. If we're going to teach him about leadership, this seems like the perfect opportunity to let him practice it." The next morning, Prince George received permission to approach Thomas directly, but with careful guidance from his parents about how such a conversation should be conducted. As George prepared for what would be one of the most important conversations of his young life, he felt both nervous and determined. He had learned something profound over the past few days. that being a prince wasn't just about titles and privileges, but about recognizing when you had the power to make a real difference in someone's life and having the courage to act on that recognition. Thomas Mitchell had no idea that his quiet years of service were about to be acknowledged in a way that would restore his faith in the essential goodness of the people he had devoted his career to protecting. Monday morning arrived with an unusual request that left Thomas completely bewildered. His supervisor had informed him that Prince George had asked for a private meeting in the palace library at 2 o'clock that afternoon. In 15 years of service, Thomas had never been summoned for a personal meeting with any member of the royal family. As the appointed time approached, Thomas found himself growing increasingly nervous. He had spent the weekend worrying about Sarah's upcoming surgery, scheduled for the following month, and wondering if perhaps his obvious stress had somehow affected his performance. Maybe the prince had noticed his distraction and was going to address his professionalism. The palace library was a magnificent room, lined with leather-bound books and illuminated by tall windows that cast warm afternoon light across polished mahogany tables. When Thomas entered, he found Prince George waiting for him, but the young prince wasn't alone. Prince William stood beside his son, offering a reassuring smile that did little to ease Thomas's anxiety. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for joining us," Prince William said formally. "George has something he would like to discuss with you." Prince George stepped forward, and Thomas was struck by how composed and serious the 10-year-old appeared. Gone was the playful child he had watched grow up around the palace grounds. In his place stood a young man who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Mitchell," Prince George began, his voice clear and confident, "I asked you here because I've been thinking a lot about our conversation last week, and I believe there's something our family needs to do." Thomas remained silent, unsure of how to respond to such an unexpected opening. Prince George continued, "You've been protecting our family for 15 years. Every day you stand guard to keep us safe, and you do it with dedication and honor. But now your family needs protection, and I think it's our turn to help protect you." The words hit Thomas like a physical force. He had never expected such acknowledgement of his service, let alone from someone so young. "Your Highness," Thomas began, but Prince George raised his hand gently. "Please let me finish," the prince said politely. "I spoke with my parents about your wife's situation. We know how much her surgery costs, and we know that you've been trying to figure out how to pay for it." Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment. The idea that the royal family had been discussing his personal financial struggles made him want to disappear into the floor. Prince William stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Mr. Mitchell, what you need to understand is that George came to us with this. He recognized that someone who has devoted his career to serving others was facing a crisis, and he felt compelled to act." Prince George reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an official-looking envelope. "This is a Special Service Recognition Award," he explained. "It's given to staff members who have shown exceptional dedication over many years. The award comes with a financial component that should cover your wife's surgery and her recovery expenses." Thomas stared at the envelope, unable to process what he was hearing. "Your Highness, I can't accept this. It's too much." "Actually, you can't refuse it," Prince George said with a slight smile. "It's an official palace recognition, and refusing would be considered disrespectful to the crown." The gentle humor in the prince's voice, combined with the formal justification, created a perfect solution to Thomas's pride. He could accept the help without feeling like charity, because it was being presented as recognition he had earned. Prince William added, "George also insisted that this be presented personally, rather than through administrative channels." He felt that 15 years of faithful service deserved personal acknowledgement. Thomas opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was an official certificate recognizing his exemplary long-term service and dedication to the protection of the royal family, along with a check that would cover not only Sarah's surgery but also several months of recovery expenses. Tears began to flow down Thomas's weathered cheeks as the full impact of what was happening hit him. "Your Highness," he said, his voice breaking, "I don't know how to thank you." Prince George stepped closer and, in a gesture that surprised everyone in the room, extended his hand for a handshake. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Mitchell. You've already earned this through your years of service. I just made sure that service was properly recognized." As Thomas shook the young prince's hand, he felt something profound happening. This wasn't just about money or medical bills. This was about being seen, valued, and treated with dignity by people he had devoted his career to protecting. "There is one condition, though," Prince George added with the hint of a smile. "I'd like regular updates on how Mrs. Mitchell is doing. And if she's well enough after her recovery, I'd love to meet her someday. Anyone who can grow the most beautiful roses in the neighborhood and volunteers at an animal shelter sounds like someone worth knowing." Thomas left the library that day feeling like a different man. The weight of financial worry that had been crushing him for weeks was gone. But more importantly, he had experienced something that would stay with him forever. The recognition that his quiet, faithful service had mattered to the people he protected. That evening, when he told Sarah about the meeting, she cried tears of joy and relief. But what moved her most wasn't the financial assistance. It was the fact that a 10-year-old prince had seen her husband's worth and had taken action to acknowledge it. The weeks following the library meeting transformed Thomas Mitchell in ways that went far beyond financial relief. Sarah's surgery was scheduled at one of London's finest private hospitals, and the procedures went better than anyone had dared hope. Throughout her recovery, Thomas found himself walking with a different posture, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that his colleagues couldn't help but notice. Word of what had happened spread through the palace staff in whispers of amazement and respect. The story wasn't about the money. It was about a young prince who had seen beyond uniforms and protocols to recognize the humanity of the people who served his family. Other staff members began to look at Prince George with new eyes, seeing in him the kind of leader who might one day inspire genuine loyalty rather than mere obligation. 3 weeks after the surgery, Thomas received an unexpected visit during his shift. Prince George approached his post with a small bouquet of roses from the palace gardens, carefully wrapped in simple brown paper. "These are for Mrs. Mitchell," Prince George said with a warm smile. "I thought she might enjoy seeing some roses while she's recovering, since she can't tend to her own garden right now." Thomas accepted the flowers with visible emotion. "Your Highness, this is incredibly thoughtful. Sarah will be so touched." "How is she doing?" Prince George asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. "Much better than expected," Thomas replied. "The doctors say her recovery is going very well. She should be back to her normal activities within a month." Prince George's face lit up with relief and happiness. "That's wonderful news. I've been thinking about her every day, hoping she was comfortable and not in too much pain." As they talked, Thomas found himself marveling at the young prince's continued interest in Sarah's well-being. This wasn't just polite follow-up. It was genuine care from someone who had taken responsibility for the welfare of people under his protection. "Your Highness," Thomas said carefully, "I need you to know that what you did for us, it's changed everything. Not just the practical aspects, but the way I think about my work here, about service, about what it means to be part of something larger than myself." Prince George looked thoughtful. "That's interesting. How has it changed things?" Thomas paused, trying to find the right words. "For years I thought my job was about following orders and maintaining security. But you've shown me that it's really about being part of a family. Not in the sense of friendship, but in the sense of mutual care and responsibility. You protected me when I needed protection, just like I protect you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other staff members. But as Prince George prepared to leave, he said something that would haunt Thomas for days to come. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Of course, Your Highness. Do you think I'm ready to be a leader? Not someday when I'm older, but right now in small ways?" The question caught Thomas completely off guard. He looked at the 10-year-old prince standing before him. This child who had recognized suffering, taken action to address it, and followed through with continued care and concern. "Your Highness," Thomas said with absolute conviction, "I've served under many leaders in my life, military and civilian. What you did for my family required more real leadership than I've seen from most adults. You saw a problem, you cared enough to act, and you found a way to solve it with dignity and respect. If that's not leadership, I don't know what is." Prince George seemed to absorb this assessment seriously. "Thank you. Sometimes I worry that because I'm young, people don't think I can make a real difference. Your Highness, you've made the biggest difference in my life that anyone has ever made. Age has nothing to do with the ability to show compassion and take responsibility for others." That evening, Thomas went home with the roses and a heart full of stories to share with Sarah. As he described his conversation with Prince George, Sarah listened with growing amazement. "Do you realize what's happening here, Thomas?" she asked when he finished. "This young prince isn't just helping us. He's learning how to be a king by practicing with kindness on a small scale. And you're teaching him that his actions have real power to change lives." Thomas hadn't thought of it that way, but Sarah's insight rang true. He was witnessing the formation of a leader who might someday rule not just through authority, but through genuine care for his subjects. The following week brought news that would test everything Prince George had learned about leadership and responsibility. Thomas's supervisor called him into the office with an expression that immediately set off alarm bells. "Mitchell," the supervisor said gravely, "I have some difficult news. There's been a budget review, and the palace is implementing staff reductions. I'm afraid your position is being eliminated as part of the security restructuring." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. After 15 years of faithful service and just weeks after receiving recognition from the royal family, he was being let go. The irony was crushing. Prince George had saved his family from financial crisis, only to have the palace administration create a new one. What Thomas didn't know was that Prince George would soon learn about the dismissal, and the young prince's response would demonstrate once and for all whether his earlier actions had been mere kindness or the beginning of true leadership. Prince George discovered Thomas's dismissal by accident. He had been looking for the guard to share good news about his mother's charity work when he overheard two staff members discussing the security restructuring. The words "Mitchell's been let go" hit him like a physical blow, and he stood frozen in the hallway as the full implications sank in. The young prince felt a surge of emotions he had never experienced before: betrayal, anger, and a deep sense of injustice. How could the palace save Thomas's wife and then destroy his livelihood just weeks later? It felt like the cruelest kind of irony, and Prince George knew he couldn't let it stand. That afternoon, Prince George marched into his father's study with a determination that surprised Prince William. The boy's face was flushed with indignation, and his usual careful politeness had been replaced by barely controlled fury. "Father, we need to talk about Thomas Mitchell," Prince George announced without preamble. Prince William looked up from his papers, immediately recognizing the signs of his son's distress. "What's happened, George?" "He's been dismissed. After 15 years of perfect service, after we just honored him for his dedication, the administration has decided his position is unnecessary." Prince George's voice cracked with emotion. "It's not right, Father. It's not just unfair, it's cruel." Prince William set down his pen and gave his son his full attention. "I wasn't aware of this decision. Tell me everything you know." As Prince George recounted what he had learned, Prince William felt his own anger beginning to rise. The timing was indeed terrible, but more than that, it represented a failure of the very values his family was supposed to embody. "What do you want me to do about it?" Prince William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I want you to stop it," Prince George said without hesitation. "But more than that, I want to understand how this could happen. How can we claim to care about the people who serve us, and then treat them like they're disposable?" The question struck Prince William with its maturity and moral clarity. His 10-year-old son had identified a fundamental contradiction in how the palace operated, and he was demanding accountability in a way that would make any leader proud. "You're right," Prince William said simply. "This is wrong, and we're going to fix it." The next morning, Prince George requested permission to speak with Thomas directly. He found the guard clearing out his locker, his movements slow and heavy with disappointment. "Mr. Mitchell," Prince George called out, his voice carrying an authority that seemed far beyond his years. Thomas looked up, his face brightening despite his circumstances. "Your Highness, I heard you were looking for me yesterday. I'm sorry I missed you." "Don't apologize," Prince George said firmly. "I'm the one who should be apologizing. What's happened to you is unacceptable, and I take personal responsibility for it." Thomas was confused by the prince's words. "Your Highness, you had nothing to do with the administration's decision." "But I did," Prince George insisted. "When I chose to get involved in your family's situation, I took on a responsibility to see it through. I can't help your wife recover and then stand by while the palace destroys your career. That's not leadership. That's abandonment." The conversation that followed would become legendary among palace staff. Prince George didn't just express sympathy or promise to look into the matter. Instead, he outlined a specific plan that demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking for someone so young. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that your dismissal is being reversed. But more than that, you're being promoted to head of personal security for my family specifically. It's a new position that recognizes your years of experience and your personal dedication to our welfare." Thomas stared at the prince in disbelief. "Your Highness, I don't understand. How is this possible?" "Because," Prince George said with a slight smile, "sometimes being a prince means using your authority to protect people who have protected you. My father reviewed your entire service record and agrees that losing someone of your caliber would be a mistake the palace couldn't afford to make." What Prince George didn't tell Thomas was the full extent of his intervention. The young prince had not only convinced his father to overrule the dismissal, but had also proposed the creation of a new position that would ensure Thomas's job security for the rest of his career. More importantly, he had insisted that a formal review be conducted of how staff reductions were decided to prevent similar injustices in the future. 2 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood in his new uniform at his enhanced post, watching Prince George walk across the courtyard with the same curiosity and energy he had always shown. But something had changed in how Thomas viewed his role and his relationship with the family he protected. He was no longer just a guard following orders. He had become living proof that service, when truly valued and respected, created bonds stronger than employment contracts. Prince George had shown him that loyalty wasn't just about following protocol. It was about mutual care and responsibility that transcended rank and title. As Sarah Mitchell tended to her roses in their garden that evening, now fully recovered and stronger than ever, she reflected on the extraordinary journey they had experienced. A 10-year-old prince had seen her husband's quiet dedication and had responded with the kind of leadership that most adults never achieved. "Do you think he knows?" Sarah asked Thomas as they sat together in their garden. "Do you think Prince George realizes how profoundly he's changed the way you see your work?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I think he's learning something even more important than that. He's learning that real power isn't about giving orders. It's about using whatever authority you have to protect and uplift the people who depend on you. And that's the kind of lesson that will make him not just a good king someday, but a good man." In his resignation letter, which he never had to submit, Thomas had written words that captured the transformation he had experienced. "I came to this job to serve a family. I discovered that the family had chosen to serve me in return. That is the kind of leadership that inspires not just obedience, but genuine devotion." Prince George's quiet deed had indeed changed everything, not just for Thomas Mitchell and his family, but for everyone who witnessed the profound impact that genuine care and decisive action could have when guided by conscience rather than convention.